Check 1, 2. One, two. Check 1, 2.
Hello, hello. Good morning, everybody. It's nearly 11 o'clock. Welcome to everyone here in St Christopher's and also to those who are watching and listening online. This is the final in the series, a very good series, I'd have to say, on health and well-being. And so thanks to John and Leslie Hunt and Leslie for putting this together. And Julian? Oh, and Julian. Julian is not here. Now the next course begins on the 3rd of June, and that's on education in the digital age. So we look forward to that. Now, a little about the newsletters that are sent out once for each series. I understand, or our committee understands, that there have been a number of people who have email but have not been receiving the newsletter. If you do not receive a newsletter, beg your pardon, do not receive a newsletter by the end of this month, then you are one of those people. And I'd ask you please to ring myself or email myself or Adrian, please. So ring Adrian, Robert, or myself if you have not received a newsletter by the end of the month. Just a reminder that the next series, as I said, on the June the 3rd, and there will be morning tea served on that day. There is one Watman in the Christchurch telephone directory. Can I think of any other smart answer? I'm sure you'll find one way of doing it, but that is one option. There is only one, WHATMAN. So, without further ado, I will ask Leslie, please, to introduce our speaker for this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. It is my pleasure this morning to introduce Maz Black. Maz started her career as a dietitian at the Auckland City Hospital, then continued her work in the UK as a locum around many of the hospitals in London, which I'm sure would have been added to your experience enormously. In 2013, she returned home and now works in private practice for Canterbury dietitians. Our very own Julian Jensen, who was to introduce Maz today and now has COVID, Julian also worked in this group until she retired. Maz has a major interest in the area of older persons' health, which includes providing advice to rest homes and elder persons' hospital care facilities. She also provides nutrition support and dietary consultations to individuals who are referred by ACC or GPs or self-referred. Her aim when working with we older people is to improve our nutritional adequacy and quality of life. So you can see she is a very suitable and competent person to talk to us on the topic of live well, eat well, the microbiome as we age. Welcome, Maz. We look forward to hearing what you have to present to us, and I hope that we all live better as a result.
Thank you, Leslie. That's a lovely introduction. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, great. Okay, so yes, as Leslie mentioned, I'm here to talk about the microbiome as we age. Just a little, I guess, disclaimer is that this area is quite relatively new to science and is rapidly developing. So watch this space, things might change, we might find out more, but a lot is still not understood about the microbiome and its effects. So, here we go. So what we'll cover today is what is the microbiome, what does it do, what happens as we age, and what can we do to influence it. So what is the microbiome? Has anyone heard of that term before? Hands up if you have. Yeah, great, quite a few of you. So the microbiome is a collection of genomes of microorganisms that live in a particular environment, and in this circumstance we're talking about within our gut, within that GI tract. The microbiota, which sometimes I might use that term, is the actual organisms themselves. Oh, thank you, that's great. So within our gastrointestinal tract we have around about 100 trillion microorganisms that live there. So that's quite a lot in just our one body. There's a lot of guests there. And if we look at that from a genome point of view, there's roughly about 23,000 genes in the human genome, and within our microbiome there's about 3 million genes. So again, you can see from that amount of genetic material, surely there's going to be an influence on us as hosts from those microorganisms. And if you break it down, that makes us less than 1% human. So what happens? How does it get there? Where does it come from, those microorganisms? So initially, when we're a fetus in our mother, there are microorganisms starting to appear in our gastrointestinal tract, and those microorganisms are generally influenced by maternal factors, so what our mother is eating, what environment our mother might be in. Later then it is influenced by the mode of birth, whether you're born with a vaginal birth or a C-section, can depend on what microorganisms you're exposed to. And then the method of feeding, so whether it's formula fed or breastfed, again you can imagine the different microorganisms that might be implanted in our guts. Later in life, it is about those first foods that are introduced, any prolonged antibiotic use, as well as the environmental exposures, that an environment where one lives, one breathes in microorganisms that influences the microbiome. But roughly around age 3, that microbiome is established. And from there on in, it just reduces in diversity and number with age. So it's a downward spiral from there. So we're talking about, I guess, what we can do to help with that and keep it as healthy as possible today. Each microbiome is individual, so you know, your microbiome will be different from yours, and that's just really depends on your exposures in life. Yes, yeah. So in terms of where those bacterial microorganisms are, they range throughout your gut, so there are varying densities from your stomach down to your colon, and you'll see that the colon has the highest density of microorganisms, and that's really where most of the research has been focused on, is the colonic bacteria or colonic microorganisms. In the colon, the number of species varies from about 300 to 1,000 different species of microorganisms, but 99% of them come from just 30 or 40 species. And if we think about the dry matter of our feces, about 60% of that is made up of bacteria. So again, that shows that huge number of microorganisms in our gut. So what do they do? So the microbiome is really one of our partners in good health. Okay, so they really help influence our health and our health outcomes. And one of the things they do is break down some of the starch that our digestive enzymes cannot break down. Some of the byproducts that are therefore produced are some different vitamins, like some of the B vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin K. The microorganisms help lower the pH of our bowel, which then helps prevent pathogens growing, so more of those negative microorganisms growing. And it may also help with calcium absorption as well. The microbiome also has a role to play in our immune system by producing signaling molecules that suppress pathogens, that upregulate anti-inflammatory markers and downregulate pro-inflammatory factors, and it stimulates the proliferation of immune cells, so the production of more immune cells in the gut as well. We know that the microbiome is linked to mental health, and indeed there is a relationship between our gastric nervous system or our enteric nervous system and the central nervous system, so there is communication between them both, and the microbiome has influence on that as well. When we look at the bacterial diversity of people who are obese or have type 1 or type 2 diabetes or any of the inflammatory bowel conditions or celiac disease, we actually see that they have a lower level of microbial diversity. So they have a less diverse microbiome. And therefore there are links to type 2 diabetes, obesity, and also some colon cancers in relation to the health and diversity of our microbiome. So of these influences, a lot of them come from the production of short-chain fatty acids. And so the microorganisms in the gut produce these short-chain fatty acids as a byproduct of digestion of fibre in the large intestine. So butyrate, acetate, propanoate, and these short-chain fatty acids are really important. So they provide fuel for our gut lining, so they keep those cells nice and healthy and not permeable to pathogens and toxins, so preventing them from getting into our bloodstream. And they help reduce the pH, as I mentioned before, which can help inhibit growth of those pathogens. They also help stimulate those immune cells, the gut immune cells production, and they can be involved in metabolism. So those short-chain fatty acids can be absorbed and transported to the liver and beyond to have an impact on metabolism, including glucose metabolism, and therefore have an impact on insulin sensitivity and our blood glucose levels. They may also be involved in appetite suppressant or appetite control as well, and there's definitely links to promoting anti-inflammation and anti-carcinogenic effects as well. So those short-chain fatty acids are pretty awesome. So what influences those microorganisms? So over our lifetime, there are physiological changes with aging that influence those gut microorganisms, but there's also changes that we can alter. So things like exposure to antibiotics, changes in diet, medications and lifestyle as well affect that composition. And I guess we're focusing very much on the diet today to see what influences the microbiome and what we can do as individuals as well. There are observational studies that suggest that there is a difference between the microbiome between long-lived people and those who are frail. So there are differences there, and we'll talk more about that with some of the studies we look at. And we also have seen studies that suggest a more plant-based diet with lower meat products in there tends to equate to a higher diversity of microbiota in the gut as opposed to low plant-based diet and higher meat quantity. It's also important to note that although short-term changes do change your microbiota or make changes in your microbiota, it seems to be the long-term diet that has the most impact on those metabolites that are produced and therefore our health as hosts. So if you're out for a fun weekend on the wines or whatnot, then that's a good thing. It's only a short-term influence on the microbiota, and really it's the long-term behaviours that have the largest impact. Cool, so let's look at a few studies around that. So this study here was published in Nature in 2012, and really looked at 178 older adults and their fecal microbiota composition. And then they grouped those individuals into where they were living in terms of location, so community, day hospital, rehab, or long-term residential care. And the crux of the study really was that they found that those in long-term residential care had less diversity in their microbiota than those community dwellers. They also found that it was influenced by diet. So originally if someone was newly admitted to a long-term residential care, it took them about a month to change over to that same diet that the majority of long-term residents were having, and then it took a further year before their microbiota reflected that of those in the long-term stay. So it really does show that short-term changes in the diet may not have a big impact on the microbiota, but those longer-term changes seem to make a difference. And within that less diverse microbiota, they also noted an indication that was associated with increased frailty and increased inflammation as well. This study was on twins, 728 women who were twins, and the average age was around 63 years. Again, they looked at the fecal microbial composition, and what they found was that there were particular species of bacteria that were associated with frailty. So they identified 12 different bacterial species that they associated then with being frail. And that frailty was negatively associated with some of those butyrate producing bacteria that we talked about before, those short-chain fatty acids, and concluded that butyrate may suppress frailty and that associated inflammation. So possibly increasing those microorganisms that produce those short-chain fatty acids might prevent frailty. This study was a cross-sectional cohort, so it doesn't necessarily show cause and effect, but they looked at 1,000 self-diagnosed healthy Chinese participants aging between 3 and 100 years old, and these participants were very healthy, so they had no health issues and no family history of disease. And they looked at then the microbiome composition there. And they found that even those in later life had a really diverse microbiota. And they also found that between kind of 30 years and 100 years, there was very little difference in the diversity of those people. So possibly that tells us that we can maintain the diversity, that it's not all downhill and our physiology isn't the biggest barrier, that potentially, being healthy and having a diverse microbiota is possible even in late age. And maintaining that diversity might be a biomarker for healthy ageing. Okay. So this study was a little bit different. It was a randomised control trial over a year, and it was multi-centred, so it was based in 4 different places in Europe. So there was Italy, Poland, France, the Netherlands, 5, and the UK. And basically what they did here, this was part of the New Age project, but they got 612 individuals and they placed them in 2 groups, an interventional group and a control group. And the intervention group was put on the Mediterranean diet. Anyone heard of the Mediterranean diet? Yeah, okay. It's always flouted as best health. And so basically within that there was a promotion of increasing fibre, so having a lot more plant-based foods, and then an increase in vitamins and minerals as well. Over that time they actually found that the control group increased its saturated fats and its monounsaturated fats. But when they looked at that group that followed the Mediterranean diet, they found that there was a relationship with modifying the microbiome with that diet, and a reduced link to a reduced frailty, improved cognitive function, and reduced inflammation. And as you might then therefore expect, there was an increased production of those short-chain fatty acids, which we again talked about earlier as being really well promoting those anti-inflammatory factors and overall health. So, from that kind of quick overview, we can see that there may be a part to play of diet in influencing our microbiome. And really the mantra, feed yourself, feed your microbiome, is a good one in terms of trying to improve the health there. Looking at a diverse diet and maybe focusing on more of those plant-based foods, such as what you'd see in the Mediterranean diet, so more fruit and vegetables, more whole grains, more whole grains, and less of the meat and the processed foods that we're seeing more in our diet as well. A variety of fibre, so fibre is the part of our diet that doesn't get digested and absorbed and gets to end up in the large intestine where those microorganisms are. So having fibre available to feed those microorganisms is important, and we find fibre in our plant-based foods. But as we mentioned earlier, diet is likely not to be the only factor. You know, there is medications, there is age-related inflammation, chronic disease, many other things that influence the microbiota. But something we can look at and change is our diet. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So a bit about fibre. As I mentioned before, fibre is the edible carbohydrate which are resistant to endogenous digestive enzymes. So human enzymes cannot break down those forms of carbohydrate, and they move down into the large intestine. And fibre is made up of soluble and insoluble fibre, and both of those are undigestible and end up in the gut, in the large bowel. And a subset of that is then fermentable. So insoluble fibre is really the bulk of our stool. It keeps everything moving. It really helps with our regular bowel motions and prevents constipation. It also controls and balances that pH in our intestines, and again we talked about how that was important to sort of inhibit pathogens from developing in our large intestine. It therefore helps remove toxins and manages some of our cancer risk as well. Some of the foods that you find, or some of the foods rich in insoluble fibre, are things like your wheat bran, your all bran cereal would have it, some beans and lentils like kidney beans have a good amount of insoluble fibre, flax seeds, they're the main kind of sources of insoluble fibre. Whole grains, so your whole grain breads and cereals, those sorts of things. And our soluble fibre basically helps form a gel, so it draws fluid in and forms a gel, which helps move things through the bowel as well, nice and smooth. It binds with fatty acids, so it stops you from absorbing them, and therefore helps lower your cholesterol, and therefore helps in terms of overall heart health. It delays stomach emptying, so it stops or slows the absorption of glucose, of sugars from our food into our bloodstream, so it regulates our blood sugar control a bit more as well. And the main foods that you would find soluble fibre in are things like your oats, your legumes and beans can be quite high in soluble fibre, and most of the flesh of fruit and vegetables is high in soluble fibre as well. And within those fibres comes probiotics. So probiotics being the indigestible carbohydrate that then benefits or provides fuel for those colonic bacteria. Okay, so it's digested in the gut, fermented in the gut by those microorganisms and provides fuel for those good bacteria. And one of the main sources of prebiotics would be your legumes, so chickpeas, lentils, kidney beans, those sorts of things. Oats, wheat, barley are also good sources of prebiotics, so we're looking at those whole grains there. Fruits and vegetables such as garlic, onion, leek, those sorts of things, and nuts, cashews or pistachio nuts. So some of those foods, if any of you have irritable bowel and have tried the low FODMAP diet, some of those foods are exactly those foods that we want to avoid for a short period of time, and that's really because they ferment in the gut, so they're producing lots of wind and gas, which encourages bloating and things which can be difficult if you have that increased sensitivity, such as an irritable bowel. But it's also a reason why you are not to follow that intensive elimination diet for too long, because if you're cutting out all these lovely prebiotics, then you're influencing your microbiota and not providing enough fuel for those microorganisms to flourish. So it's important to follow a dietitian's advice around which things to avoid longer term. So how much should we be having as individuals then to be able to nourish our body in terms of gut health as well as our microbiome? So the recommended daily intake for fibre is about 25 grams a day, okay? And if you are having the recommended 5 fruit and veg a day, so 3 vegetables, 2 fruit, plus some more if you can, as well as some whole grain breads and cereals, around 6 serves of those a day, you're on the mark for hitting that fibre requirement. But variety is key. So because we have a variety of different microorganisms in our gut, we need to provide a variety of different fuels as well. So having the same food every day and limiting to, only a couple of types of vegetables or one type of fruit isn't going to really help in terms of the diversity of our microbiome. And as we mentioned, that diversity is key in terms of good health outcomes. So how are we doing in New Zealand around those guidelines? There's an annual health survey that the Ministry of Health does, and one of the questions within that is around fruit and vegetable intake. And although I think the latest annual health survey, that might have been swapped out for food insecurity. But anyway, if we look at the 2019-2020 results around just that fruit and vegetable intake, we can see that 33.5% of the population are meeting those guidelines of 5+ a day. So that's not a huge number. If we break that down further, 54% ate at least 3 serves of vegetables and 51% ate at least 2 serves of fruit. You can see on that diagram there that the group that are highest in terms of fruit and vegetable intake tends to be the 65+ group. So our younger people are not doing so well in terms of getting fruit and vegetables into them. And the sad part about it is that actually this number is the lowest it has been since the survey began in 2006, 2007. So we can see that our intake of vegetables is just declining, which is not ideal. Because if we're not having fruit and vegetables, we're not having fibre, we're not really feeding that microbiome as one of the consequences of that. So how do we up our prebiotics and our fibre? One of the really simple ways is by trying to add a bit more legumes into our diet. Okay, so you can sprout your own or get some alfalfas from the supermarket or mung beans and add them to salads or use them as a bit of a snack. You can substitute legumes for meat, so sometimes having a meat-free Monday, which is quite trendy at the moment, and having a vegetarian meal instead, or making sure you're adding legumes to soups, casseroles, curries, having things like falafel or hummus or lentils in your cottage pie. There's a few ways that you can add them in. And if you're buying the tinned variety, they're quite versatile, really. There's no soaking and things like that for 24 hours. So what does a high fibre diet look like? So this is an example, I guess, of what a high fibre diet would look like. Fruits are in red, whole grains are in yellow, vegetables in green, and your beans and lentils and nuts and seeds are in blue. So the important thing is, though, that when we're looking at increasing our fibre, that's fantastic. But as older adults as well, there are other nutrients that we need to focus on. So protein is a big one, calcium and vitamin D as well. But protein being really important because we're wanting to maintain our muscle mass, which impacts on our mobility, our function, our skin integrity, our immunity, all these things. And so ideally a meal when you're over 65 should be based on protein, and I guess that's the benefit of your legumes and lentils, is that they also provide protein in addition to fibre. So in summary, we know that the microbiota influences our health and disease state. We know that a reduction in number and diversity is associated with frailty. And so a diversity in that microbiota is important, but also a diversity in our diet is important to be able to feed that microbiota. And we can do that by increasing our fibre through whole grains, legumes, fruit and vegetables, and really trying to do that long term. So not just, having a day of it or a week of it, but trying to make sustainable habits that will stick with, to be able to have an influence on our microbiome. And in the future, watch this space. I think there'll be much more targeted probiotics, so reintroducing bacteria back into those guts that have reduced diversity and reduced numbers. But at this stage, the evidence is still emerging as to what those things might look like. But I think that's where things will head. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Sorry, I went quicker than I thought.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating and a little worrying at times.
But I didn't tell you what not to eat, did I?
I'm sure there'll be some questions, and may I ask those who are going to ask a question just to move up to the back of the church, please, and use the microphone there.
Anne Marsh, retired physio. I'm interested in the protein. Do you get enough protein from the legumes, and can you manage without meat, or do you recommend some meat? How would you work that?
Definitely the portion of legumes to get a similar protein content as opposed to meat or eggs, you have to eat a lot more. So a portion of lentils and legumes is more of like 3/4 of a cup, while meat, it's about 100 grams or a palm size. So it is much more challenging to get the full protein from legumes and lentils alone. And so I would say if you're happy to eat meat and eggs and dairy products, then I would encourage them to be part of your diet, yes. Yeah.
Robin Walker, you say that the butyrates help reduce frailty. So what can we add in our diet to increase the production of butyrate?
Yeah, so that butyrate comes from that fermentation of the fibres in the colon, and so having those prebiotics and all that fibre coming through into your colon will feed those bacteria so that they flourish in terms of number, and therefore be producing more of butyrate as a byproduct. So really having more in terms of the variety of fibre and the prebiotics will encourage the growth of those bacteria that then produce butyrate.
So nothing specific, you mean?
Mainly those prebiotics, so the legumes, the nuts around cashew nuts, the onions, garlic, those sorts of things in your diet. Yeah, the whole grains, the oats, the wheat. But it is about variety, so we want a diverse range of bacteria and microorganisms in our gut. So again, if you focus just on one type of fuel, then you will have only a small number of microorganisms that utilise that fuel, so you'll actually be narrowing the type or the diversity in your bowel. So you want to have a variety. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Ms. Cynthia Hampton. Ms., how much water is enough and how much is too much? I just notice young ones, especially my granddaughters, they seem to be clutching a water bottle the whole time, consuming huge amounts of water. Is this good or not?
It's very tricky to overdo water, I must say. It just means you're going to the toilet a whole lot more. But around 30 to 40 mils per kilo of your body weight. So that works out, depending on how big or small you are, from 1.5 litres to about 3 litres a day, depending again how physically active and things you are. So on average, I'd say, 1.5 to 2 litres is adequate.
Does this include the cups of tea and coffee? And
it does, absolutely it does. So all of those fluids count. So even though tea and coffee have a diuretic effect where It means you're going to the bathroom more often. It's only a minor effect in association with how much fluid you're getting from that. So yes, tea and coffee do count.
And what about, I always understood you could actually flush water-soluble vitamins out of your body. Is that true or not?
No, so if you're having more soluble vitamins like vitamin C than your body needs, then that will be excreted in your urine, yes. But by upping your fluid intake, you're not necessarily washing them out, no.
Thank you.
No worries. An exception to the fluid is alcohol. That doesn't really count as hydration. Just in case you were thinking.
Sue Shannons, regarding the FODMAP, I found that to be really amazing, instant relief from pain and discomfort after about 3 days of being on it. But do I understand from you that you shouldn't continue to be on it because I'm now frightened to go back to the things that I know cause the problem?
So when you do go on the low FODMAP diet, you're cutting out a variety of different fermentable carbohydrates. And then the next step is reintroducing them and seeing what your tolerance is to certain fermentable carbohydrates. And from there, you should only be limiting a few of those groups. It is also really important because our gut health changes, and particularly with irritable bowel, things change in terms of when we're flared and what triggers us, and stress and all of those things. It's important to retry those foods at different dates, so probably every 6 months, just to see if you can tolerate a bit more. But as long as you haven't limited all of those groups of fermentable carbohydrates, then there should be enough variety to feed your microbiome. But if you're keeping all of those low and you're afraid to introduce any of them, then I would encourage you to see a dietitian to help make you feel more confident about reintroducing some of those.
There was only a few that I found out I limited in the end, but
Yep.
I'd like to try and reintroduce some of those to see what happens.
Yes,
That
yeah.
would be reasonable.
One at a time,
Yeah.
slowly, on a week that you don't have too many appointments.
Alistair Stokes. I hear fibre and colon is obviously an important part of your message. What message would you then have for those who are very short on colon, having had a lot of it and the gut removed?
Yes, very good question. Now that's very individual. So as I mentioned at the start, there are microorganisms all throughout the gut, and it's very much, the research has been focused on the colon because it's more easily accessed in terms of what we see in our fecal matter. But there are microorganisms throughout, so they still need feeding and they will still have a beneficial effect on on you as a host. It may be, so we still recommend fibre if you don't have a colon. It depends if you've had other parts of your bowel removed as well in terms of how you tolerate fibre, but fibre is still an important part of your diet, yeah.
Guy Crozier. In some sectors of the community at present, it's very fashionable to become a vegan in order to save the planet. Does a vegan diet provide the necessary nutrition you need for long-term good health?
It can, but there needs to be good planning around it. So there are particular vitamins, so B12 for instance, you can't really get in adequate amounts in a vegan diet, but you can then get that provided in a supplement or a monthly injection. In terms of protein, it can be challenging. As I said about the legumes, you're needing much higher quantities of legumes to be able to get the same amount of protein. And things like calcium as well, you need to be really aware of choosing fortified calcium milks if you're not using kind of cow's milk, obviously. So there is a whole lot of planning that comes with being vegan and meeting your nutritional requirements, and if you don't do it well, it doesn't necessarily improve your overall health at all.
Ivor Watson. You did touch on antibiotics. What is the effect of antibiotics on the microbiome? That's one question. And the other is, how do the nutrients move from the bowel or from the gut into our body?
Yeah, really good questions. So antibiotics, what we do see is the effect is more if you are having prolonged use of antibiotics. So as I mentioned, those short-term dietary changes, the same with antibiotics, that's sort of short-term, the microbiome seems to bounce back. It is more the longer term that can influence the microbiome, absolutely. And there is, research to say is there a specific probiotic that we can reintroduce into the diet after that prolonged use of antibiotic to try and reculture the bowel. Yeah. Your second question in terms of how do those, was it the short chain fatty acids, how do they get absorbed and move into the body? Is that correct? Yeah, so they can be absorbed into the epithelial cells, and a lot of them are used for fuel just by that gut lining of the cells, but then they can also be transported through the portal vein up into the liver as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Andy Shand. About 5 years ago, we commonly read about targeted probiotics. It seemed to be the way of the future. It was going to cure diabetes, obesity, some mental diseases, and all sorts of other things. And with the fecal transplants seemed to be the way of the future. I've read very little about it in the last couple of years. Has all that research stopped? And is it no longer the hope of the future? What is happening in that field?
Good question. Good things take time, I think. So there really just isn't the clinical trials at this point to give us enough information or enough evidence to make recommendations. For some individual disease states, there is more solid information about what probiotics we might recommend. But in terms of general health, no, there is not enough evidence there, and same with trying to improve our microbiome as a whole and make it healthier. There's not enough clinical evidence as to what probiotic. The concern is when you're adding a probiotic is that you're adding 1 or 2 strains of bacteria or microorganisms into the gut. And like mentioned, you want diversity. So if you're introducing 1 or 2 strains, they may flourish, they may overtake and diminish the other microorganisms in the gut. So there's concern about just adding one individual bacteria in. Fecal transplants are happening in the world. They're mainly happening, or they are only happening with clinical evidence under if someone has had the infection of C. diff, and they find that having a fecal transplant can replenish the microbiome after that. But there is definitely still research going on around whether a fecal transplant can help with obesity, weight control, diabetes. That research is still going on, but it takes a while for it to come from animal trials into human and have enough of a clinical base or evidence base before it's evidence-based practice, I guess. So still coming, just takes time.
Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Peter Gordon.
Hi, Peter.
Your talk has raised lots of questions for me. I'll try and limit it to one. However, I'd like to comment. You mentioned about being on a diet for too long being dangerous to health. When Shane Warne died a few months ago, there was a suggestion, wasn't there, that he'd been on some diet that may have led to his premature death, but that's up to you to comment on or not. You haven't mentioned cheese and bread, but the thing I'm more concerned about is those of us who are on long-term medication. Should we be worried at all, and should we be consulting anyone other than our normal doctor?
Yes, that's it. I'm certainly not advocating that you stop your long-term medication. I guess going back to one of the original slides, we don't know how much our physiology, our diet, our medications, our lifestyle, our chronic disease status, we don't know how much of each of those proportionately impacts on our gut microbiome. And because everyone's microbiome is individual, it's very hard to say, well, let's take a sample of yours and find out what's going on. I think if you're doing your best to provide a good variety of fuel for your microbiome, so giving those healthy plant-based foods into your diet, then that will help promote the healthy bacteria that are already there. I mean, you can only do what you can do, you know. So, no, at this stage, there's no one really that you can see to say, hey, what else should I be doing, or is my medication having an effect on the microbiome? We don't have enough of that kind of evidence base as yet. Does that answer your question?
Well, thank you for that, and I'd like to commend my wife because she goes into the 5 vegetables and 2 fruits a day, which is great.
And you mentioned, bread and cheese. So your whole grains, so things like wheat, oats, barley, if you're having a whole grain bread, then that's perfect, okay? So rather than going for a white, and if possible, either a whole meal, you'd go for the grainy type, and then you're getting more of those prebiotics. Cheese is great for your bone health and your protein intake as well, so everything is fine with that as well. Don't overdo it, but don't skimp on it either.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. A huge number of questions, a lot of interest. I have a personal question, please. Baked beans, ordinary tin baked beans, as good as your homemade? You said homemade up on there. Is it important that it's homemade and not just common ordinary old Watties baked beans?
Yeah, baked beans are good, absolutely. I guess often baked beans come with a whole lot of sugary sauce, and so homemade is better because you can control that a little bit, but absolutely the baked beans themselves are providing you with some good legumes there, and if that's the way you eat them, then go for it.
Thank you. I'll ask Jean Lindo to give the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Oh, Mayers, what a fascinating morning you've created for us. We do have to think a bit more. I'm glad you explained what the microbiome was. I trained as a dietitian about 1 million years ago, and it was a new word in our language, and for a lot of people here too, I'm sure. I was quite relieved too when you started talking about food rather than all the stats and things. But what a helpful thing you've done for us and increased our knowledge of what we should be eating all the time. Great variety. Sometimes it's quite hard to remember all those things for lots of people. But thank you so much for your time and your great knowledge, which has enlarged ours as well. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much. I hope you'll accept this on our behalf.